So usually people think a question is to get an answer to, and that's what we do. You know, if you have a question, find the answer. And that energy, there's a vacuum there inside a question that tells us to move in the direction that it's pointing us to. But the most powerful questions don't move towards a point. They open us up into a space. They focus our attention not on a point, but on a particular realm of inquiry. So we can go there individually with our attention and our thinking and our feeling, or we can go into it collectively in conversation. And the more powerful the question is, the more it leads us in directions which we discover new understandings, new possibilities. So I like to think of it focusing attention, but focusing it on a space, a territory, a region, which has energy and mystery and potential in it. And one of the most powerful questions I love, because it's what I call a zipper question. You can unzip the question, remove the specific focus topic and put a new focus topic into the question and zip it back up again. And this is from the World Cafe people, who are among the most brilliant question designers. And they were working with a school that was in trouble I think it was in Italy. And instead of, what's the big problem in this school or how should you fix it up, they said, what could this school also be? It's a very interesting to study the structure of that question and, how it opens up into a space of possibility. It draws your attention into a place where there's breakthrough capacity, new ways of thinking come naturally out of that question. And you can then, it's a zipper question because, what could a pattern language also be? What could a democracy also be? It's like, whoa, what an interesting, you go into interesting, unpredictable places asking a question. Different groups would come up with different answers. But there's juice in there, there's life energy in there. And living into questions, I mean, what is it like if you were in a group, for a day, going, what could our group or our community also be? Is great. You come up with great stuff, but then what if people are invited to continually think about this, feel into it, and share their insights? What is the meaning of life? What is art? I mean, some of these questions don't have any answers you can really nail down, but you can live into them depending on who you are. What is the best? There's Fran Peavy, who is a master of question creating, strategic questioning. She created a whole field of strategic questioning, questions that have leverage, for change. In the morning, she would sit and meditate with a globe, and she would ask, what is the greatest service I can do today to the world and to future generations? So she was living into that question. And the questions that generate, Fran Peavy also is one of the first people to point out that questions can generate change without even being answered in the usual way. She was working in India, and there was she was trying to help clean up the Ganges. And it's an awkward thing to clean up the Ganges because the Ganges is sacred, but it's full of dead bodies and, human shit and whatever. It's just like a mess. So how do you talk about it? And she noticed that all the meetings she was in all had men. And she asked with real curiosity, where are the women? And she did that 2 or 3 times. And a day or two later, suddenly there were a bunch of women at the meetings. And it's like, she wasn't judging them or evaluating. She was just curious. Where are the women? And they had to go through stuff in their heads. The men had to go through stuff in their heads to work through to the point where they recognized there was a problem and brought women in. So that's an interesting one. And saying things like, what is art? What's the meaning of life? That's treating the question like a fruit-bearing tree. Like, you can harvest new answers over and over and over and over again. So these are some of the power of questions, and there's things to know about how to create powerful questions that evoke energies out of people and creative approaches to things. And one of the most powerful ones is, don't ask a question that can be answered with yes or no. Don't ask a question that has one answer. Don't ask a question that is trying to move people. Like, why don't you do it this way? That's barely a question. That's a statement, a strong recommendation masquerading as a question. So learning how to do open questions that draw people out, draw their thinking and feeling out, is what this pattern is largely about. And as I mentioned, World Cafe is very powerful. The book, The World Cafe, by Juanita Brown, David Isaacs, and the larger World Cafe community, has more than 100 questions in the text as the process and its implications are being described. Many, many, many examples. And as I mentioned, also strategic questioning, Fran Peavy. She wrote a whole pile of stuff on this, a little booklet about it, lots of stuff online about it. Appreciative inquiry has, trying to get beyond looking at a problem and as a problem, and looking at when that realm that the problem exists in was handled well, about things that people would like to have happen in that realm, looking at all the positive dimensions of it. And they use questions where people involved in the scene interview each other and evoke memories and visions about what would be possible, what would make sense to do here. And dynamic facilitation has these few very high strategic kinds of questions, which, like, what's your concern? Somebody's being, creating lots of disturbance or throwing adversarial energy into the group. It's like, what's your concern? And it's a powerful question because it reframes their objections and their all the energy, the adversarial energy, as something valuable. They have a piece of the puzzle which is showing up as a concern, which is a much lower energy, energy phenomenon than adversarialness. And then after they've said their concerns, like, okay, if you were in charge of the scene, what would you do? And that kind of, again, just notice the shifting of energy that happens to that question. And Quakers have questions that they live into. They're often moral questions. During the Vietnam War, when I was part of a Quaker meeting, there were many issues where, Quakers are largely pacifist, but they're also, many of them were strongly anti-communist and felt, believed in the domino theory. If Vietnam fell, other countries would fall. Many people would be oppressed by the communist system, et cetera. So they were caught in a quandary versus, their pacifistic inclinations and the sense that this communist threat needed to be controlled. And so it was often offered into the larger Quaker meeting, Quaker community, Quaker fellowship, how do we respond most creatively to the issues raised by the Vietnam War? And people would reflect on that in the meeting for worship and also talk with each other. So it was a question held by the